Well, the examples I just shared with you, the clothing, the coffee beans, are rather minor ones. In the email that I sent you a week or two ago, I mentioned that perhaps the biggest, the most consequential of the brand extensions is the National Geographic Channel.
Mm-hmm, right? Of course.
Which is actually majority owned by Rupert Murdoch's News Corp. And now, as you probably know, Mr. Murdoch is known mostly for his tabloid-style journalism.
Right.
And not the sort of blue-chip television documentaries that have long been associated with National Geographic. So I had a couple more slides I wanted to show you. What I'm going to do is show you sort of the contrast between the magazine, which has really been sort of the anchor for the brand for many years, and the channel. Is the slide up? Can you see, or is it gone dark?
It's not. Yeah, okay.
We're up?
I got it.
Okay, so what you're looking at here, this is a cover from the actually centennial year 1988 of the magazine. This is just their
of course.
coverage of wildlife, global warming. What's that?
Parks.
Yep. A piece in December on the King James Bible. This actually is from 1940s during World War II. It was very much a journal of a society. It had very much a national sensibility rather than the international one it has today. So that's the magazine. And now I'm going to show you some things from the channel. So as I said, it's a News Corp property. So this is a show, Locked Up Abroad, which is a primetime show. Shows about drugs. This is a series called Taboo. This particular episode was about a man who has relations with a plastic doll. This is a documentary on sex addiction. Piece on American Nazis. And this one actually, this is from just this week. This is a new show that premiered 2 nights ago called Diggers. It's about, I think it's about extreme, what is it called? Extreme metal detecting.
Okay.
It's sort of a treasure hunting show. And it looks, at first, it sort of looked like a reasonable extension of the National Geographic brand, except it caused quite a stir. Archaeology Southwest called it looting as reality TV. There was an online petition that went up a few days ago asking the channel to kill the show. And the Society for American Archaeology wrote a letter to John Fahey, the CEO. Can you read it? Because I can't. What is
Sure.
it?
The show is contrary to the ethics of American archaeological practice, highly destructive and possibly illegal. Or at least the people participating in the show. The show cannot be legal given the First Amendment, right? I mean,
right. So the reason I show you these things is, given that gulf between the magazine and TV, can you talk to me a little bit about why a brand manager might intentionally give two very different kinds of promises, tell two very different kinds of stories? Why, from a brand perspective, that divide, which you've just seen, makes sense?
Well, I don't think it makes a lot of sense to have the same. Well, it looks like the television channel is competing with other reality shows, for example, might even be competing with the History Channel, for example, right? Other channels which are not National Geographic type channels. But on the other hand, the magazine, like you said, is an informational educational magazine. Now, it's possible that the two have different customer segments, but even then, I would not think this would be a very good idea to have the National Geographic name on such a channel, because it would end up diluting the brand name. And I don't think they have the same brand manager at this point, right? Usually they probably have different brand managers, but that's just a very practical explanation for that, why they have such different brand promises. But it's not good for a brand to have two very different confusing promises, because it'll dilute and confuse the brand name and the brand promise and equity in the mind of the original target customer. One way to get around it is to have two different names for the different channels or different brands.
But then you lose the value of the brand in the first place.
Oh, you're losing the value of the brand anyway, because the brand would be diluted by making conflicting promises and stuff like that. So the brand's it's hurting. Anyway, in the other case, as an extreme example, you would say that a car company, like I said, would not put its Mercedes would not put its logo on the Smart brand car because it's a very different kind of a car. It might have its own reason to exist, the Mercedes versus the Smart car, but you just wouldn't put the Mercedes name on it. So, if you're asking me about, does it make sense to have two conflicting promises with the same brand name on it? Very clearly, no.
Does it strike you as a sustainable strategy? Actually, before we get to sustainable, let me take you back to what I think, and I'm really guessing here, was the rationale for doing it. And I think the rationale was when the channel launched back in 2001, I believe it was, I think the sense was some people watch television, some people read magazines.
Right.
And these two media universes exist, they're parallel universes, they never intersect. So you might be able to get away with making one promise to your print magazine audience and another promise to your television audience. Why?
Yeah, you can't really make such conflicting promises because that's not true anymore. That people intersect. But also, even in 2001, you wouldn't want to make conflicting promises because it will eventually end up diluting the brand name and there's no upside to doing that. You can have different promises. For example, a Belgian beer, which is a very blue-collar beer in Belgium, it has a promise of being a very upscale beer in the United States. I mean, that's possible. These are not necessarily conflicting promises, but again, I would try and get out of that kind of conundrum as well if possible. But in this case, clearly, even in a world where your segments are different and they don't perhaps necessarily overlap a whole lot, it's not a good idea to have different brand promises in different categories. It's just not a good idea to have Johnson & Johnson have a promise of trust and care in children's category and a promise of being very sexy in the women's category. It just wouldn't make sense.
Well, let me play devil's advocate. And I'd say to you that I think the rationale, again, you say, what's the upside of making this promise? The challenge was the Discovery Channel got out of the gate far earlier than did National Geographic Channel on cable.
Sure.
So they were playing catch-up. And to play catch-up, they had to quickly get into a global market. They had to find a partner who would get them there and get them there quickly. So the upside, you say, what's the upside of telling these two stories? The way they were going to get there was doing shows on American Nazis and the sex addiction for a global audience through News Corp Fox channels. That's it.
Well, I don't want to second guess anybody else, but the whole point then there would be that if you want to compete with Discovery, then the original brand promise of National Geographic, which is the black and yellow colors, the information, entertainment, education, a channel for the entire family, for school children, there might be a place for that promise. There might be a place for two people in that space within the media or online space. So Discovery might be first off the gate, but Friendster and MySpace were the first social networks. So I mean, Facebook could have made themselves exactly like MySpace, and that might not have been a very good idea for them. So, but that might have been their rationale. I do not know. But in general, it's not good to have conflicting promises with the same brand name. It only ends up diluting your brand promise and your brand eventually.
One of the things that struck me over the last year or two as I played around with the iPad and you see the convergence that's going on in media, my sense is that it becomes even more complicated to sort of have the right hand doing one thing and the left hand doing something else, because they're converging on the same platform. It might have been someone was reading the magazine in the living room, someone else was watching TV down in the den, right? But now they're converging on the same space.
You're right. It's harder today. Media convergence is much greater than it was in 2000 or 1995 and 1990 and so on. But therefore, it's almost impossible today. 10 years ago, these two people might be in different rooms, but they'll still talk to each other, and then the brand might get confused. But today, it's probably close to impossible to do that, of course.
So in the last 10 years or so, give me, in your opinion, what's the best example of strong brand management when you look out on the landscape of the business world?
Okay. Do you mean brands that that were created in the last 10 years or brands that are been around for a long time but are continuing to be strong. So for example, brands that have been newly created, of course, one has to talk about brands like Google and Facebook and of course Apple, which is a little older than them, but these are all very strong and valuable brands. Some foreign brands that to talk about is brands like Kia and Hyundai in the car segment. Some other brands in services, perhaps you talk about Geico right here closer to home is a good brand. So these are all good examples of strong brands.
And what makes them strong? Why do you cite them?
Well, because they have created an identity for themselves by making a promise that consumers can rely on, and obviously these promises are different in different categories, and delivered on that promise day in and day out with everything that they do on all these media that you just talked about, from iPad to e-readers to television to newspapers to social media sites to magazines, PR, etc. So everything about the brand talks about that promise or communicates that promise to their customers.
Any examples of brands that made one promise 20 years ago and changed the promise and were able to bring people along? You mentioned when we talk about National Geographic, it was one thing. Mm-hmm. Perhaps it's becoming something else. What's to say that they can't pull off that change in promise? Brands
can evolve over time. For example, a long time ago, Marlboro was a cigarette for women, right? It was early on enough, but they weren't a cigarette for women for a very long time. It's for a very short time. And the promise at that time obviously wasn't rugged outdoors and cowboys and as you can and lassos, as you can imagine. But they changed and it did that. I'm sure if I think hard enough, I can think of examples of companies that have made similar changes in their promise. Politicians try to do that once in a while, even though I know that's not the discussion here, but it can get them into issues. In fact, politicians sometimes do something in the primary and something else during the election, but then they had to only compete with one other person there, so it's a little easier for them. But for car companies or the television channels or others, you have dozens of people standing in line to take advantage of any slip up that you might make. So a brand can evolve, and its promise can evolve over time, which is to stress the fact that it can slowly change over time. But it's very unlikely that it can turn on a dime, or it can turn around very quickly and promise something completely different and pull it off right away. I mean, I just can't think of too many examples of that. But I can definitely think of examples of where brands' promises evolved over time. So you can make, for example, Toyota a more upscale brand by adding things like Lexus, which itself will pull up the Toyota brand name.
The Marlboro case is an interesting one. How did they do it? How did they go from a woman's?
I just don't know how they did it. It's probably because it was so long ago that branding and brand awareness and stuff wasn't high, so they had not created a strong women's brand. So it would have been much harder for them to do if they had. So they obviously either failed or decided early on to not pursue that brand positioning and brand identity and promise and try to flip it around. So they did it early enough. I guess that's the one answer. Everybody always quotes that, but there's very little data or hard information. People have guesses on that, but nobody really has hard evidence or information on how they were able to pull it off. But it was early on in their evolution.
Well, I'm on my way. I don't know where I'm going. I'm on my way. I'm taking my time, but I don't know where. Goodbye to Rose, the queen of Corona. See me and Julio down by the schoolyard. See me and Julio.